you, Soferet Julie Seltzer. Julie is amazing and a good friend from back in the day and a wellspring of Torah, and we are greatly blessed to be led at MJL with her work. Yeah, I want to add about Meron. So it's traditional that people go to Meron, which is where the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a Kabbalist, and the grave of Rabbi Akiva, whose students were the ones who were afflicted with the plague, and the lifting of the plague is the thing by which we celebrate Lag BaOmer. So people flock there. I went there it was like 23 years ago. I was at Meron. And it's a wild place because it's just people and bonfires and dancing and singing. And it's a joyous experience and a bit chaotic. And it is sad that it was what happened. From the very brief reports that I've read is that there was something of a crush and a stampede. So we're thinking of all those who lost their lives, trying to celebrate a holy celebration, and a refuah shlema to all those who are sick and injured and recovering. It's good that we are in the middle of the Omer, and that I was blessed with this week's Torah portion, which is Parshat Emor. That word has nothing to do with the word Omer. But we are, because this week's Torah portion deals with the counting of the Omer. The broad overview is there's a bunch of stuff in here. We're at the very, very end of the book of Leviticus. There's a bunch of stuff in here about sacrifices, as usual. And then there's a bunch of stuff about holidays, a lot of stuff in here about the Jewish holidays. And so in order to not give everyone PTSD about the fact that the high holidays are coming up, I am not teaching about the high holidays. Additionally, there is a really interesting text that commentators all fixate on, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. So I'll try to break things up into like roughly there are three texts that we're going to look at this morning in 3 little 10-minute chunks. So for those of you who have seen me teach before, it's great to see your faces again. Thanks for coming back, or thanks to MJL for welcoming me back. For those of you who've never seen me teach before, great. I'm a conservative rabbi. I work in Pittsburgh. I teach a bunch of classes. My congregation is up in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's about a 2-hour drive. And I'm really interested in Chassidut. Chassidut is the mystical wisdom and literature of 18th and 19th century Eastern Europe, overwhelmingly, with a few other exceptions. This week's text is Hasidic-like, but a lot of the texts are really medieval in nature. And there's a little bit of a spin through Jewish history with this one. I'm also always interested in mentioning a few things about the personalities we're learning from. And this week, because we have a bunch of interesting medieval personalities, it might be extra noteworthy to kind of additionally think about those individuals who we're going to be looking at. So anyhow, yeah, and with that, let's get going. Okay, so I'm going to share screen with you all, and hopefully technology will not fail us. Everybody can see this. Thumbs up? Beautiful. Thank you. I'll make it as big as the universe, God, Google, and Zoom allow me to. So we're looking at a verse in Leviticus 22, verse 32. And I'll read it for us in the Hebrew. V'lo techalalu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. Ani Adonai mekadishchem. So the Hebrew there, the word that you see pop up no less than 3 times, which always for our rabbis is a phrase, they would use the phrase darsheni, right? Like this word calls out to us, explain me, right? So the word Kodesh shows up 3 times. Most of you probably know that the word Kodesh means to sanctify, make holy, separate, elevate. There are many different understandings of this word. And the rabbis are going to be very interested in that. The other thing that they're going to be very interested in is the specific use of this term right here, which is Shem Kodshi, my holy name, right? They're going to be very interested in the concept of sanctification for the name, which is a thing that we're going to kind of talk about. So the English of this, which I forgot to read, is, "You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you." So I looked at a number of commentaries, and many of the commentaries, like a commentary book on a parsha will typically, pick 10 verses and do a little bit here and a little bit there. Most of the commentary books I looked at in this Torah portion, there were a dozen commentaries on this line alone. And the reason is because this verse is the basis for a concept in Judaism that is deeply important theologically, especially to medieval Jews, and that is martyrdom. So kind of a serious topic, but even if, and theologically, it can have some difficult implications for us. But I think it's a worthwhile idea to kind of explore about, like, what it means to be a person who believes in your faith to the degree that it may end up causing you suffering or even death, and whether there is kind of like a reasoning for that. I'm going to fully put out there that I don't know how I feel about this text in particular, whether I agree with it theologically. I do think the concept is worth exploring, whether you're going to like it or not. So that's kind of a warning. The other piece is, we are talking this first text. The other two texts are lighter and nicer. This one's a serious, heavy, weighty topic. So trigger warning. If thinking about martyrdom this morning is not really something you were bargaining for, mute yourself for 15 minutes, go make a cup of coffee, do the dishes, and come back. That would be my advice. But I still think this text is pretty interesting, especially if we think about it in situo historically. So Rav Avram of Slonim, who passed in 1883, said, "Why must we endure so much suffering and death? If a Jew receives to themselves suffering with all their heart, it is considered as if they gave over themselves in true service. Thus it was revealed by Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, of one of the martyrs, whose name was Rabbi Shabtai." So I'm going to pause there and just explain a little bit. So as I mentioned, the words here that are important for many of our rabbis is Shem and Kodesh. And they flip those words, and this concept that's being explicated by our rabbis is a concept called Kiddush Hashem, which is literally translates as sanctification of the name, but more figuratively is understood as martyrdom, right? And the big question that all the rabbis are going to ask on this verse is, why do people die because they're Jews, right? Why do people die because, and specifically we're talking about a rabbi who lived in Eastern Europe during the era of pogroms, and he's going to quote a rabbi named Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who lived through the Third Crusade. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg the town of Rothenburg is next to Speyer, Mainz, and Worms in the Rhine River Valley near Frankfurt. And this was like the highway of the Crusades. The First, Second, and Third Crusades all kind of stopped off in Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg's town to commit atrocities against the local Jewish community. Because as many of you probably know, it wasn't just like the movie with Orlando Bloom where he gets on a horse and he rides to the promised land and fights the infidels, i.e. the Jews and the Muslims. The Christians who were involved in the Crusades did a lot of killing of Jews and Muslims who were living in Western Europe and Spain on their way down, because the Jews living in France, according to them, would have been considered infidels. Well, why travel 3,000 miles to kill infidels when you can do it in your hometown? I don't mean to make light, because it was terrible and traumatic, and a lot of the rabbis in the medieval period kind of grew up with martyrdom as a major theological issue for them. But so Avram of Slonim is going to spin this out and ask kind of the bigger theology question of, like, what's the meaning of suffering and death? Why is this here? So he says, it was revealed by Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who is known as the Maharam, in 1793. And I think I'm sharing my screen, so you should be able to see this picture. Do we see this picture? That's me at the grave of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg outside of Frankfurt.
I think you still you stop the one share and then start the other.
Oh, no. Thank you, Julie. Well done. All right. I'll have to share screen and then pick that one. Okay, there we go. How about that? That's a picture of me. Good. Okay, that's a picture of me by the grave of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. One of the customs, as you see by this grave, is you put rocks, and sometimes people put notes of prayer on top of a grave of a holy sainted rabbi like Rabbi Meir. I'm making this is, by the way, I had hair back then. This is a 23-year-old picture. And the other interesting thing about this is I'm making this kind of face because there are two other famous rabbis who are buried somewhere in that cemetery, but nobody that was on the tour knew where they were. So that's why I'm making that funny face. Anyways, back to our text. A little show and tell. I don't know how many folks who teach this show off the grave that they're at, Julie. But so anyways, we're back to our text. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, that one of the martyrs, one of the Kedoshim, whose name was Rabbi Shabtai, in a night vision, that in the days of great destruction, that those who were killed in the service of Kiddush Hashem, that there were many who intended to take their own lives, but in the end remained alive, and are all regarded together on the same spiritual level. So Rabbi Avram is dealing with an interesting issue, and I think the issue is considering, and he's quoting Rabbi Meir, this is a 13th century understanding of survivor's guilt, is the way I understand this text, right? The question that's being asked is, why do people die because they're being punished for being Jews? And why do other people live? And how do the people who live reconcile the feelings of surviving a traumatic incident, right? It's easy to say, this person is a holy martyr. You know, they died in God's service. But then you have to ask the question, why did I survive? And what does that mean about me and the meaning of my life? And so I think nicely here, the rabbi brings a text that basically says, those who endure and survive a traumatic experience that might have been Kiddush Hashem, might have been martyrdom, they are also kind of holy martyrs of a type, right? They are all regarded together on the same spiritual level. And I like this. I just think the idea that, 700 years ago, our rabbis understood that even though there is a holiness to those who die in a crusade or in a pogrom, there's a holiness to surviving a crusade or a pogrom or the Holocaust, right? Like, we shouldn't get caught up with the idea of martyrdom too deeply, that we venerate those who passed as, having been called home to lie with God, and that those who were left behind are of some other spiritual status, perhaps lesser spiritual status. I think this is really interesting because it's an exploration of what it means to die for the sanctification of God's name. But I think also, and lastly, and I think that, this is a very, tevya, to life l'chaim spin on it. Like, what does it mean to live for God's name? What does it mean to move forward in the world and say, like, I'm going to dedicate myself to being a holy individual, and I'm going to live for those principles. And chas v'shalom, I should not have to die for them. Okay, that's our first text. We're going to keep going and do two more, and then I'll take any questions that you guys might have. Julie Seltzer put the text in the chat, so if you want to come back to this first text and ask a question, you can either put it in the chat and I'll mention it at the end, or if we allow kind of the give and take at the end with audio, you can come back to it and ask. We're going to move on to a lighter topic, which is this time period that we're in right now called the counting of the Omer. For those of you who are regulars to this class, I am sure the other teachers have mentioned that we are in this liminal period. I love that word. I think it's a thing they taught us in rabbinical school, and I'm not sure I've ever gotten a really clear definition, ideally, of what liminal means, but it's a good word to use. Liminal period between Passover and Shavuot. And the way we celebrate this time period between Passover and Shavuot of 49 days is we count the Omer. And the basis for why we count the Omer shows up in this week's Torah portion, which is very fun. And I'll give you the basics and the background of it first. So we'll start off with the Hebrew. Usfartem lacha mimacharat hashabat miyom habi'achem el Omer hatnufa Sheva Shabbatot Tamimot Teheyena. In English, and from the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Shabbat, Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. The next line says, Ad mi macharat ha-Shabbat ha-Shvi'i tisperu chamishim yom v'hikravtem mincha chadasha ladonai. You must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. Okay, so couple things, many things happen here. Thing one, for those of you who are not aware, we count the Omer from Passover Shavuot, not just because we're anticipating this NASA-style countdown, although it's a count up, to the big moment when we receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. It's originally that in the Torah, in the time when the temple was standing, Jews would go on pilgrimage, and during this time period of 49 days, the new barley harvest would be coming in. And during the new barley harvest, you would bring sheaves each day into the temple, and the priests would wave the sheaves in some sort of mystical ceremony, right? And the waving of the sheaves took place each day. And each day, the priests would count, today is the 23rd day of the waving of the barley sheaves. Okay, so that's thing one. Just the basic of what is this and why do we do it? There's 2 other weird things going on in this text. And thankfully that we have the Talmud, because the Talmud explains some serious weirdness. Because if you're looking at these 2 verses and saying what's going on here? This is really confusing. The answer is you're not alone. Everybody thinks these 2 verses are fairly confusing. The first problem that is mentioned here is the phrase, the day after Shabbat. Right? Okay, so if it's the day after Shabbat, we're talking about Sunday. If we were to count the first Sunday after Passover, 49 days or 7 weeks, Shavuot would always appear on a Sunday, and it wouldn't necessarily be 49 days after Passover. It would be 49 days after the first Sunday following Passover, okay? So that means in some years it could be 56 days, in some years it could be 52 days, in some years it could be 49 days, right? This is like how in tax times, right? For those of you who are doing your taxes, we all know that April 15th is tax day, unless April 15th falls on a Sunday, and then the IRS will push it off a day to the 16th, right? The rabbis solved this problem really strangely, which was they basically said, this doesn't actually mean Sunday. It just, that when they say Shabbat, they don't really mean Shabbat. They mean the 2nd day of Passover. And so therefore, Shavuot always falls out exactly 49 days after the beginning of Passover. But they solved it by ignoring the word Shabbat, right? Or the day after Shabbat. By the way, I learned in a podcast a couple weeks ago that Karaite Jews don't do that. Karaite Jews do it the way I mentioned it before, which is Shavuot follows 49 days after the Sunday after Passover, which means it can be 56 days or 49 days or whatever. For those of you who are accountants or mathematicians, you're all right with me right now. Many of you are like, I don't know what he's talking about. There's something weird with the numbers. That's fine. It's not integral. The second weird thing, and this is what our Hasidim are going to play with, is there's some weirdness in the final 2 couple words of our verse, which is mincha chadasha ladonai. You shall bring a new grain offering to the Lord. So that's a problem because the word chadasha usually refers to a special kind of grain that is the new wheat harvest, not the barley harvest. The other thing that's problematic is the word mincha. Some of you may know that mincha is one of the 3 daily prayer services we have in Judaism. It is based on an offering that was brought to the temple, and the offering that was brought to the temple was a cake of fine flour, and that flour was wheat flour. So these 2 verses are super confusing for the rabbis. 1, what day are we talking about? It's unclear. 2, are we talking about the barley harvest or the wheat harvest now? It's unclear, right? The Talmud deals with it and basically says there are two different offerings. There is a new grain offering of wheat and a barley grain offering. And they actually go backwards a couple verses in the Torah to verse 9 of Leviticus 23 to say they're talking about the barley harvest. Here, we're talking about the wheat harvest. So this is a very good example of how the Talmud is necessary to harmonize weird and confusing things in the Torah. Because if you don't have the Talmud, or if you don't have rabbinic exegesis kind of explaining these two verses, you could very easily be super confused. All right, that's the background setup. I know there's a lot of information here. Some of it's not essential, so don't worry. Because the bigger question that we're interested in as spiritualists, as Jews, as people who believe deeply in finding meaning in Torah for all time's sake, we're going to ask the question, which is really simple. Why count the Omer? Like, what does it do for me? Like, what spiritually can I gain from this weird countdown thing of 49 days between Passover and Shavuot? So we have two neat answers. And one is, again, a medieval rabbi, although this one is not from Germany. This one is from Spain, from the holy city of Barcelona. This is Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Barcelona, who died in 1290. Some people think he wrote a famous book called the Sefer HaChinuch. Other people think that that was ascribed to him erroneously. I'll let it be up to you whether Aaron Halevi wrote the Sefer HaChinuch or not. Sefer HaChinuch was one of the first countings of the 613 commandments, because many of you probably know the Talmud says there are 613 commandments. You know what the Talmud doesn't say? What they are. Nobody ever actually accounted for them. This is like a very big accounting week in Torah. Oh well. So the first guy apparently ever to attempt to account for all 613, not the first, one of the first, was this guy, the Sefer HaChinuch. Maimonides also was one of the first accountings. Maimonides, I think, is a little bit earlier than this. Okay, anyways. Aaron Halevi of Barcelona. The only purpose of Israel is Torah. And on its account, they, the Israelites, were redeemed from Egypt. And it is greater in their eyes and more important that the very core of freedom and the reversal of being enslaved to being free. Freedom is tangential. Torah is of the essence. That phrase I love, so I'm just going to read it in Hebrew. Ha-shechrur tefel, v'ha-Torah ikar. So tefel is like extraneous or like tangential, and ikar is like core or essential, right? Torah is the core, freedom, right? That's the kind of riff going on here. And because it is essential, the Torah, we were commanded in the counting of the Omer, 50 days which fall after Pesach until the giving of Torah, in order that we reflect on the great desire of our lives of the day, which was weighted upon our hearts, like a servant desiring shade, constantly desiring to be free, wondering when the time will be for freedom. Thus, the counting of Omer shows a person that all redemption and desire is for this moment, i.e. receiving Torah. This is the explanation of why the process of counting is so and so many days are gone in the counting of the Omer, i.e. why we count up, and not so and so many days are yet to come in the counting of the Omer, i.e. counting down, to demonstrate the strength of our desire and preciousness of arrival at the long-awaited day. So a really interesting riff, and I'll pull it apart and explain it a little bit, right? Which is, why do we count from Passover to Shavuot? And the basic answer is we are anticipating the giving of Torah. But more so for Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Barcelona is to kind of really put the focus of the Jewish world not on freedom, because freedom is freedom, right? It can be used for good or it can be used for ill. A person who is truly free but has no rules, no morals, no compass might be the kind of person who says, I'm free. I'm going to be an Epicurean. I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm going to engage in as many acts that are good for me and bad for other people, right? I'm going to pollute the waterways. I'm going to buy a Ferrari Testarossa and never donate to charity, right? Like, I'm going to be extremely self-focused because I have freedom. I can do what I want, right? So freedom without anything else, without guidance, is problematic. And so Aaron Halevi is basically saying, freedom is only tangentially important as it relates to Torah, right? Freedom allows us to move towards Torah, and it allows us to use our free will to make good moral choices based on the text of the Torah, which we will receive at Sinai at Shavuot. So there's this really nice idea of, we are counting up because we are moving towards Torah. And we want to give ourselves a pat on the back for the work that we did in moving in that direction. And that's why we count up, basically. The Omer shows a person that all redemption and desire is for the moment of receiving Torah, right? Like we're just moving in this direction. So I want to highlight this concept of kind of like the Omer as a liminal space of movement from one kind of pole, freedom, to another, which is Torah, because our second text is going to do a really nice job of kind of like doing a fun thing with this. And if you were like wondering, Rabbi, why did you explain to us this whole convoluted thing about the wheat and the barley? Aha! The third text of the day is going to be the payoff here. And it's really lovely. I really, really like this one. And this will be our final text for the day. And then I'll answer questions and we can take a look at what's in the chat. The verse that they're going to be playing with is V'hikravtem mincha charasha l'Adonai, right? The thing that I mentioned at the end of the text above, which is, and you shall bring a cake of fine flour or a mincha offering, which is new to God. So this is going to be a problem for another medieval rabbi who lived through the Crusades. This is Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchaki, who lived from, I think, 1015 to 1105, or like 1025 to 1105. And he lived in the town of Worms, which is next to Rothenburg. In fact, that cemetery of the picture I showed you at the very beginning is next to what's called Rashi House, which is the original yeshiva of Rashi, which was destroyed by the Nazis in World War II, and the Jewish community of Worms and Frankfurt reconstructed it from the rubble in painstaking detail, and you can visit it today. Very cool. So Rashi, the essential commentator on the Torah, says the following: "This is the first fine flour offering brought of the new grain. Usually this would mean wheat. And if you say, behold, this is an offering of flour of the Omer, which is barley, it is unlike the rest of the grain offerings, for this is brought from the barley." Okay, Rashi uses some fairly unclear language to basically say the thing that I said before about the problem the rabbis had, which is we seem to have shifted from talking about barley to talking about wheat. What's going on here? Are we talking about, is this first mincha offering barley, or is it wheat? And Rashi's answer is, here we're talking about wheat. A couple verses earlier, we were talking about barley. So Rashi does a move, and his move is basically, it's both, right? They do during these 49 days, they do a barley offering, and they do a wheat offering. All right. Our final commentary of the day is going to be this one. Rabbi Shmuel of Slonim, who is the son of Rabbi Avram of Slonim, who taught the first text. There's like a lot of machatonim in this text here, right? There's a lot of family. We've got a bunch of medieval rabbis hanging out with each other. We've got Shmuel, the son of Slonim, who's the son of his father Avram, right? It's a family day here at My Jewish Learning. Okay. That a family day that crosses 600 years of Jewish history, which I find amazing. So anyhow, Rabbi Shmuel of Slonim taught, what's the deal with bringing the Omer offering from barley, which is animal feed, and 2 loaves on the holiday of Shavuot from wheat, which is people food, right? So Shmuel's move is to go even further, right? Like, why barley? Like, barley's not good. Who cares if the barley harvest is coming in right now, right? This is what I'm gonna feed my cow. Any of you who've ever had, barley toast or barley bread, it's kind of rough. And, even back hundreds of years ago, the rabbis were like, listen, if you can get wheat bread, get wheat bread. It's nicer, right? He keeps going. Because in Egypt, the Israelites were surrounded by ritual impurity, like a baby animal in the process of birth. So this is just a quote from a midrash. As Chazal, our rabbis of sainted memory, say in the midrash. And in there, the Israelites, going out from there, i.e. Egypt, they were still likened to animals. And this explains their offering, that still at the holiday of Shavuot, they arrive at the moment of being elevated to human, and thus they can bring wheat. I like this a lot, right? So what's going on here? The barley harvest, we bring in every day to the temple, each day, but we also are moving in the direction of the new wheat offering, which is also brought in each day, which culminates with the giving of 2 loaves of wheat bread at the temple on Shavuot as part of a sacrifice, right? We're kind of growing in our lives from barley to wheat, from animal to human, from freedom to moral obligation, right? Shavuot is the holiday in which we are given the Torah, and the Torah is the holiday in which we're given all the obligations to love our fellow human being, to not wrong them, to keep just and honest weights and measures, to tzedek tirdof, to establish justice in the world, right? To give generously to tzedakah, to give generously to gimilut chasadim, to volunteer at your local food pantry or your soup kitchen, or to help people out in your community who are in need, right? Freedom is freedom. Freedom's great. Being free is great, but it's like barley, right? It's sustenance, but it's not ideal. So we're moving from kind of a lower state of human existence to a higher state of human existence. And that is these 49 days, right? Progress, process, development, growth, all these really important ideas as a human being of moving forward, right? The final thing I'll kind of say is, I think another thing that happens in Judaism and in human existence and in coronavirus pandemic quarantine is that we are, as human beings, we are constantly looking forward or looking backwards. But in the words of Ram Dass, we're not very good at being here now, right? We're not present in the moment. We're constantly thinking about when I get to Shavuot, or that great time I had at Passover. We're looking forward to when I get on that plane to go see my grandkids, or the Hawaiian vacation I'm going to take, or when I finally get vaccinated and I can finish this, that, and the other thing that I was going to do before I got into quarantine. And the recognition here in our text is that we're on a path of growth, and that we're moving in a direction, and that we should be really happy with the process that we're going in. That process of growth, of growing from animal to human, from going from barley to wheat, is holy and sacred and valuable in and of itself. So, enjoy the process, be invested in it, and accept it. With that, I'll take whatever questions get tossed out in the chat. And Julie, I don't know if people should unmic themselves if they want to ask a question, or if they can just ask questions in the chat. It's up to you.
We can do both. There were a few questions already in the chat, and if anyone wants to ask a question verbally, just let me know with the virtual raise hand, or you can send a chat that you want to ask a question, and we'll get you unmuted.
First question is a really easy one. Miss Biamia Reed, how is Shabtai a martyr? Wasn't he a heretic? So Shabtai is just a name. And this is a Rabbi Shabtai who is not Shabtai Tzvi. And the reason we definitely know it's not Shabtai Tzvi is because the rabbi who is quoting him is Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who died in 1290. Shabtai Tzvi died in like 1665 or 1675 or something like that. So we're talking about another guy named Shabtai, kind of like, you shouldn't all confuse me with, another Mark Goodman, who some of you may know was a VJ for MTV back in the day. I am not him. He is not me. There are multiple Mark Goodmans in the world. There are multiple Shabtais. Okay. Another question that got tossed out. If we are aware of the liminal state that we are in, or that the community is in, then is it possible we can also be in it but unaware on a subliminal level? That is a deeper question than I may be equipped to answer, Gina. I really like it though, but I think you bring out a really lovely idea of presence and non-presence, but being unknowingly aware of things, right? Like the universe moves us on a spiritual level towards things that we're not aware of all the time. I like astronomy, I like space a lot, and I like to think, like, we often think that we're sitting still here in our houses and so on, but we often forget that we are revolving around the earth at the pace at which the earth turns, and the earth is spinning through the universe, revolving around the sun at literally tens of thousands of miles an hour. So it's all relative, right? As you said in the relationship idea. And what we are aware of and what we are not aware of at any given moment in our process is a really nice thing. So this was just a great moment to be liminally aware of our progress towards a goal. Okay, great. Other compliments, comments. Someone said, "Hooray, you are a winner." Cool. I assume the check is in the mail, or I get a lottery ticket. But that is very nice. So thank you very much. And Jane Sterling added, the barley animal hardship concept going towards wheat human freedom is pretty cool. Thanks. I think that what the Hasidim are often doing is they're often trying to find a moral, spiritual entry point to something that is kind of antiquated, right? Like, how do I wake up in the morning and read a text about an ancient ritual that hasn't taken place in the temple 2,000 years ago about a barley harvest, right? And I don't know about you guys, but I don't really buy barley at the store. I don't really think about barley much. And counting the Omer is really cool, but the literal of barley, like we've gotten away from the literal of it. So it's fun. It's fun to kind of pull all this together. Okay. Esther has a question, I see, and Patrick has a question. So,
okay, so go ahead, Esther. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, I did. I have a problem with your interpretation of Mincha Chadasha, because to me, I associate Shavuot with Chag HaBikurim. So, which means, and it's also one of the 3 times a year that we went to the temple. So, as I grew up, we were always told that you bring the first of the harvest to the temple. So the Chadasha, I look at as as the first, instead of the way you explained it.
Yeah, you're right. You're right according to some interpretations, right? And basically there are multiple medieval rabbis, and going all the way up until the 17th century, arguing about that verse. And they have basically, Esther, 3-ish interpretations. One is, we're still talking about the barley harvest. One is, no, we're talking about Yashan and Chadash. For those of you who read packages of kosher foods, there's a kind of kosher food that you can get in a market, bread or bread products called Yashan. And in the ultra-Orthodox world, typically, there's a desire to make sure that you are eating the grain that you are permitted to be eating at this given time. So that's kind of to Esther's point about whether this grain is Chadash or Yashan. And then the last piece is what you said, Esther, which is there's a third thing going on here, which is all of this is confusing, and there is no consensus in the Jewish world, because why would we have consensus? We're Jews. We love to argue, right? The third thing is exactly what Esther said, which is this concept of bikurim, right? First grains, first fruits, first harvest. So Shavuot is exactly what Esther said. It's all of those 3 things. It is the first harvest and the first grains, but the bringing of the Omer takes place in the 49 days preceding the bringing of the bikurim. And the Yashan of the wheat, we're not entirely sure whether it starts at Passover and goes till Shavuot, or whether the wheat harvest only begins with the Bikurim, as Esther said. Thankfully, because we don't live in temple times, it's an esoteric argument and not a literal one. All right, thank you, Esther. That was great. Patrick, did you want to ask your question? Is that okay, Julie?
Definitely. Patrick, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
There he goes.
There it is. Okay. All right. I once heard that we all know that an omer is a unit of measure, and the grains were all brought to the temple in omers. And one of the rabbis that I was talking with at one point in my life said that the reason that they take 7 stalks of barley rather than wheat was because barley has 7 rows and 7 the stalks, and if you take those and you multiply it by the 49 days or the 7 sevens, what you actually come up with is exactly 1 omer of barley. That doesn't work with wheat.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I love that teaching. I appreciate that you added to that. I'll just add one additional teaching to that before time runs out on us. There's this, one of the things we do during the Omer, and it's related to Meron and Lag BaOmer. It's a nice way to conclude based on what Julie opened up with, which is thinking of the folks in Meron today, is we connect to Kabbalah. And we often do a counting during the Omer where we mention the Sfirot, right? Which Sfirah we are in, and they are, it's Netzach Sheba Netzach or Hod Sheba Hod, right? But as you all know, probably, there are 10 Sfirot, not 7. So the question is, what's going on there? And there's an idea in Kabbalah that human beings only have imminent access to the divine in the lower 7 Sfirot, right? The 7 of the 7. The highest 3 Sfirot, which are Malchut, Bina, and Chochmah, or Chochmah and Da'at, I think. I forget. Depends who you translate with. Are only reserved for the divine, the Holy One, blessed be God. But we are constantly moving in that direction. We're kind of progressing towards, and we're going upward as we move towards Shavuot and the holidays in which the Torah is given. That's my time for today. I hope you guys learned a little bit of Torah. I learned a bunch from both Esther and Patrick and from a lot of the comments that were made. We should all merit to go from barley to wheat, from animal to human, and towards cheesecake and blintzes.